David Allen Miller in Cosmos. Checking on someone about music and other stuff.
Hi, I'm David Allen Miller. Here's my full interview with the amazing Derek Bermel, one of the most fascinating composers I know. I hope you'll enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. Here I am with one of my very favorite people in the whole wide world. And while this is a series called Cosmos, checking in on someone about music and other stuff, to be absolutely truthful, I check in on this guy a lot because he's so wise and so knowledgeable, but I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about his past. And by his past, I don't mean what he had for breakfast. I mean like his formative influences. So here, Derek, how are you, my dear?
I'm fine. I'm hanging in there. How are you, David?
So is everybody. You're hanging in. I gather from all the composers I talked to that the only upside of this challenging pandemic is it gives you a lot of time to create art, right?
Yeah, I suppose if you can get your mind in a good place.
That is true. It's, I think, hard for everybody to figure out how to focus on things like what we used to call work and all that kind of stuff. But I really wanted to talk to you kind of because you're such a fascinating musical polymath in that you're a great composer, you're almost like a real ethnomusicologist of sorts, you're a fabulous clarinetist and teacher and mentor. And start back at the beginning. You started out as a clarinetist in, is it New Rochelle or White Plains?
Uh-huh. Actually, I was born in Manhattan, but yeah, by the time I was playing clarinet, we had moved to New Rochelle. My dad was teaching theater at Lehman College, and my mom was an editor. So Lehman was in the Bronx, so it was very close, right next to New Rochelle, really. And I was in third grade when I started playing clarinet.
So how old were you when you moved to New Rochelle?
6 or 7, something like that.
So like kindergarten or first grade, something like that. First grade?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And your dad, I didn't know until not that many years ago, was actually English, because I never noticed the trace of English accent that you still have to this day. It's quite extraordinary. Yeah, just kidding. So tell me a little bit about him, because I don't know that you've ever told me about him other than that he was a theater professor.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy. He was a British Jew, and he was from the south part of London, southeast London, which like Stepney, Woolwich area. And he was so when he was a kid during the war, his father died when he was 11. He was evacuated with his brothers and sisters out to the coast. And because they were the only Jewish family, they couldn't get anyone actually at first to take them in. So they stayed in this center. And I guess they were kosher, so their mom was checking on them. And but of course they loved eating the non-kosher food like fish and chips and things. But as soon as the mom came, she found that, and she.
So did his father?
She had a hard life. My grandmother, during the war, she lost her husband. She had 4 kids plus another kid who died, and so my dad really grew up taking care of his brothers and sisters, and he was the man in the house. And
did his father die in bombings or in something related to the war? Or
his brother died as an
infant. No, his father.
His father died right at the outset of the war. No, not from the war. He died right. He actually, I think he fought in World War I in the British Army, and he died in 1939, right at the outset of the war. They don't even know what he died of. Something, in those days, I think sometimes you didn't know what people died of, but my dad grew up in that kind of environment and went into the army in 1946, and then was kind of bummed around, and eventually made it he got into the London School of Economics, of all places,
Um,
It's a very,
and he
very
was,
famous, very famous theater school, the London School of Economics. Yeah.
well, actually, it was a place when he really got to indulge his theatrical whims, and one of his best friends there was a guy named Ron Moody, who went on to play
Oh yes,
Fagin
Fagin, of course, famous.
in
Yeah,
Oliver, yeah, the
right.
movie.
Did he
So
study? Did your dad go there ostensibly to study economics and just sort of lost his way? Is that?
I think he wanted to go to one of like Oxford or Cambridge, or but he didn't. He's told me he got stuck on one question. So he said he used to tell me on a test, never get stuck on one question. Just move on to the next
Changed
thing.
his whole life, the whole course of his life. One
Yeah.
question, huh? Yeah. And then how
But
did
anyway,
he?
when he came to the States, then he just came over on a boat actually in the 50s, and he ended up in New York. First in Canada for a while, in Toronto, then in New York, and he worked in advertising, writing copy for men's adventure magazines.
Ah,
And eventually, he made his way into theater, which was his love. He was a playwright, and he wanted to be in theater somehow, and so he had that circuitous route.
wow.
But he was the first in his family really to have any higher education.
And he met your mother on a blind date, I think you said at some point, or?
Yeah, they met on a blind date with two friends, one of who was a friend of his from England, and she brought my mom along on the blind date, and then my dad ended up crashing into a police car,
Really?
and then
See, this is the stuff we've all been wanting to know. We know all this. We know all the regular stuff. This is the important stuff. He crashed into a police car. Please go on.
he crashed into a police car, and then he and then he told me that, well, he has his own version and my mom has another version. He said the police car crashed into him, and my mom said no, I think he crashed into the police car.
Well, what did the
But
policeman say?
they both agreed that the cop went around collecting witnesses while my dad sat in the car, and chose the ones who supported
His version,
So,
right?
so they ended up bailing my dad out that day, and so it was an interesting start.
Yeah.
But,
And it's you and a brother, your brother, right? You have one brother?
yeah, my older brother is a Slavic linguist.
Didn't he
And
go back
went-
to the motherland? Didn't he go back to England or no? Yeah. And he
Yeah,
teaches
he
there.
lived in Sheffield.
In Sheffield.
Yeah.
Wow. Went back to the homeland. That's great.
Well, it's
so
pretty good job,
fast forward a little bit to the third grade when you take up the clarinet, because I gather that your whole life journey into composing really came via your clarinet playing. Is that right? Because I remember through the years you've told me stories about somehow meeting John Corigliano because you'd heard his great clarinet concerto, and I know you at a certain point met Steve or got to know Steve Sondheim a little bit. Tell me how the clarinet playing sort of got you toward your composing life, and also it obviously opened you to a lot of different kinds of music traditions, primarily jazz, along with what we call classical, I guess. Well, I don't call it that. Other people may call it that.
Well, I heard you call it that once, but
No, I never
anyway,
did. That was somebody else. David Allen Miller.
So, well, I started playing clarinet when I was about 7 or 8, but even before that, even when I was a very little kid, I don't remember this obviously, but my mom would tell me that even when I was 1 or 2, I was picking out tunes on the piano, and I used to love singing. And so when I started playing the clarinet, that was one thing in terms of my musical education, learning how to read music. But I think when I really started being interested in composing was when I started the piano. My grandmother had bought me a beat up piano from one of our relatives, and she brought it home, and I started immediately composing, and then I became very enamored of the music of Thelonious Monk.
And this was when you were about how old? How old were you then?
Oh, probably about 11.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I was listening to Monk all the time. I bought all his albums with all my, allowance money, and so yeah, that was a really important thing for me, because I think even today, Monk is probably the composer who had the biggest harmonic influence on my work.
Fascinating.
But but of course, as you say, I did hear the clarinet concerto of John Coliano when I was about 8 or 9, and it had a huge impression on me. And my parents took me to see the New York Philharmonic doing Stanley Drucker
Stanley
playing.
Drucker, who
And
had premiered
it
it,
was
sure.
in
Yeah.
it was at Lehman College actually when they
Oh,
opened a new arts center, and
and
my dad was teaching, and my dad knew John a little bit from teaching because John also taught at Lehman
right,
College,
sure,
and
for years,
um,
many years.
yeah, yeah, and so
But there was something
so that
about the music. You got the music, or you wrote a letter, or what's the story?
no, John, my dad just saw John one day in the hall at Lehman College and said, I just wanted you to know that we took my son, who just took up the clarinet. We took him to see your clarinet concerto, and he absolutely loved it and was really blown away by it. And the next day, my dad went to his mailbox, and there in his mailbox was a copy of the clarinet part for John's clarinet concerto.
Wow, that's neat.
So
Uh-huh.
yeah, it just showed that he's somebody that's very special.
Right, and so
He cared enough to do that,
he still
and I still
is,
have it.
and he's still an incredibly caring person, as you and I both know. He's a wonderful man. So fast forward a little bit. So you went to high school in New
Yeah,
Rochelle. Then you went to a small liberal arts college called Yale University, ostensibly not as a clarinet major or a composer major, just as a smart guy. But you sang a lot while you were there, right?
yeah. Oh yeah, I sang in an a cappella group.
What was it called?
Yeah,
Your acapella?
high school was we were lucky to have a really good band program, and so I learned that repertoire, and I was composing a lot for my friends, just writing a woodwind quintet and even an orchestra piece actually that I wrote when I was 15, and and a lot of different things just for my friends at school. And when I got to college and I started singing, I was really intrigued with writing for the voice. So I started doing a lot of arranging for a cappella. And I probably did 30 or so arrangements. Most of them were really, really bad, but a few of them the group still sings. One of my most ambitious was Bohemian Rhapsody.
Wow,
Uh,
huh?
and I
Fun.
taught that to this group, the Baker's
Uh-huh.
Dozen. I think I really bludgeoned them with that arrangement. It was just so hard, but they managed to do it and record it. A lot of those guys. I was an all male group, but a lot of them are still very close
Yeah, I
friends.
gather. I had the privilege of being at your wonderful wedding party not too long ago, not too many years ago, and it was great that it seemed like all of them were there, ready to sing. They all sang with you. That was so beautiful, touching, really nice.
Yes, that
So
was
what
it.
else?
Was
What else? What else did you glean from that? It was you went to Yale, and then immediately after that, did you go to Israel? Is that what happened? Is that the timeline,
uh,
or did you
well, I
did you go
went
to
to
Israel
Yale,
after
and
Michigan?
uh, I when did I go to Israel?
When did you go live in Israel? Didn't you live there for?
Oh, yeah, I went. That was troubling for my parents, that I wanted to go to Israel. I think they found that very troubling. They thought I was going to come back with like
Or that you were
chaos,
gonna
the
stay
whole the
there?
whole
That
nine
you were gonna.
yards. Yeah.
Uh,
Um, but I,
that was after
I what,
right after college, or when did you go?
yeah, I went right after college. Yeah,
Because
I went. Well, there was a teacher that I worked with a little bit at Yale, whose name was Jan Redzinski, who's a Polish composer, and he had studied in Jerusalem with Andrei Haiduk. So he's he suggested that I try to work with Andre, and I reached out to a couple of grant foundations that supported students who wanted to go to Israel, and I managed to cobble together about $3,000 worth of grants, which basically paid for everything I did that whole year in Israel. I
wow,
was very I my rent was 50 shekels a month,
I'm sure
and
that's very good.
I was living. Yeah, it was the life there was pretty Spartan, and I was living on Harat Sofim, which was Mount Scopus, on a campus actually at the uh, at the campus at the university on Mount Scopus, and so it was. But it was an incredibly inspiring place to be, very beautiful and with so much history. And I had very little knowledge of my own background as a Jew. I hadn't gone to Hebrew school or anything like that, no bar mitzvah. So
Because your
I was
parents
like,
were leftists, that's why, right?
yeah, they were
were
like
they were like-
communists.
Right.
Yeah.
Uh,
So because of that, I think it was a really new kind of experience for me just to be around a lot of what was presented to me in Israel. And it was of course, Israel's a very intense place. And so connecting with my roots in that way was interesting.
and was that a
I
year?
can't say it was all good, but it was really, really interesting.
Were you there for a year or longer? 1 year?
For about 9 months, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then I had a friend who passed away, who was one of my close friends from college, and I came back around then.
And I gather that experience, because of Haidu, was really transformative for you. Is that right? Or what did you glean from him?
I think he taught me to stop. At the time I was writing, I was very influenced by Bartok and Messiaen and certain composers, and I think I was really writing in that style. And Haidu said to me, "You have to write you have to write your own story. You're writing someone else's music." And so I had to get in a place where I really could get to my own thing and to try to write the music that was inside myself, which is hard. I mean, it's a lifelong kind of quest.
You're not the first American composer who's been told that, right? I mean, I think that's the whole story of Aaron Copland and Roy Harris, and kind of the entire 20th century of American music is finding one's own American non-European voice or unique voice.
Well, and even for the Europeans, I mean, everyone has to find their voice. Every artist, and probably every conductor too, right? I don't know. You probably
Yes.
had to.
Yes, it's not the same kind of voice, but you have to find what you're most passionate about, and then you have to find the intersection between what you're best at and what you're most passionate about if you want to have any impact, I suppose. But that's true of every field, I think, right? I would think. Maybe.
You said it. See, I should be interviewing you. It's the same.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a conversation. It's not really an interview. It's more of a conversation. But even though it's not an interview, so
Right.
but you also
But
told
I'm not
me,
asking you questions about.
that's fine. I have nothing to say. I have nothing further to say. But you also talked to me at various times about how much you learned vis-a-vis orchestration from instrumentation, how to write for instruments from Haidu. Wasn't that a very important part of that, or?
Oh yeah, because the thing is that Haidu made me. What we did was every week he would make me orchestrate in the style of a different composer. I mean, ironically,
As you found your own voice? Is that
what?
It doesn't sound like that's the way you find your own voice, but okay.
Well, in a way you do, because if you don't know what others have done, then you might assume that you invented something pretty cool.
Right.
But if you know what Debussy did and what Stravinsky did and what Schubert did and what I mean, there's a lot of things that have been done.
Right. You
So,
discover that you're not as original as you thought. That's
Yeah.
that's worthwhile. That's great.
yeah.
And then you came back, and then you immediately went to Michigan. Is that right? After
Yeah,
that?
and so just Haidu, every week we would orchestrate two piano pieces of a composer, say like two Schumann piano pieces in the style of Schumann. Then I would bring him that music, and then he would look at it and say, no, Schumann would never write, an A for the bassoon, or B flat is too high, And so then for that time, not that you can't write it because you know what Stravinsky wrote, but in other words, he tried to get you to write very much with the limitations of that era and that composer,
Cool.
and the kind of choices that composer would make. And that was really, really interesting because it gave me, he used to tell me that every score had a look and you had to get to know the look. And so those were invaluable for me. But then at Michigan, well, after I got back from Israel, actually I taught kids who were, kind of learning disability kids, and a lot of kids that had been taken from their own homes by the state because they were in difficult situations.
In New York City?
So
Were you in? This was in New York City.
yeah, these were kids from New York, and they were taken to like a group home kind of place where they were living, and they were from all over New York. And so I worked there for about a year and a half, and then I applied to schools, and I got rejected from most schools
Did you? Huh?
except the University of Michigan,
Huh?
which gave me a scholarship.
That's
So
great.
so it was lucky because Haidu, before I left Israel, had written to Bill Bolcom for me and kind of said, Bill, you should, this student has a lot of things that you might have in common. And little did I know, but it wasn't just Bill Bolcom, but the student body at Michigan was way more aligned with where I was, because there were all these interesting composers from Detroit, and it was just a great place to be in a lot of ways for me, because I could connect the interest in jazz and a lot of other things with my own ideas about music. And it was a great place to grow. Up until that point, I had had no real performances of my music by any professional musicians. Everything I did was on MIDI, you know?
Because as a lot of people may not understand, Yale has this great composition program, but it's pretty strictly graduate, and you were there as an undergraduate. So it was a very different experience for an undergraduate, although I gather you had some interaction with the famous professors there, or not really? Not too much?
No. I mean, I saw a master class once, but I was very disconnected from the music program, except for a couple of composers like Michael Tenzer, Jonathan Berger, Jan Radzinski, those people. But we weren't really allowed to be part of what they did at the graduate school at the time.
I think they're a little nicer about it now, right? They include the undergrads a little more now.
Oh yeah. Like I did a master class there, I think in November, and it was everybody was there, the
really
undergrads,
nice.
the grads, and the whole faculty. So it felt like they've really managed to make that a place where they pull in all the creativity from the whole school, which is great, I think. Yeah.
So this is kind of really interesting as you tell the story of your life and your ancestry and Thelonious Monk, etc. It sort of clarifies some things for me, but in a way it sort of clarifies this kind of yin-yang back-forth thing you do, because you're so informed by American indigenous music and by jazz particularly, but then you also have spent a lot of time in Europe with Louis Andriessen, with particularly with not Messiaen, with
Dutia.
With Dutia. You studied with Dutia, didn't you, for a while, or?
Yeah, it was an interesting year. That was after I finished Michigan. I went well. Before I finished Michigan, I went on a very interesting trip to Ghana, and I spent about 4 months there.
The Ji'il playing, is that right? You learned to play the xylophone?
Yeah.
Cool.
I learned to play the
How many months?
About 4 months.
Wow.
I was there total. It wasn't that long, but just long enough to get a sense of things. But of course, I was in a very rural area, so it was very different than being in New York. I mean, people there were mostly living in mud huts, and at first I found that really strange. But once I realized that they were much cooler than if you built a house, because there were some European colonial settlers who had built houses that had thatched roofs, and they were horrendously hot and stifling. So I was glad to get out of there and be in a mud hut and be on the roof, because it was so much cooler to sleep at night. And it was amazing. I met people there that just were had such big hearts, and incredible musicians, some of whom were farmers during the day, and they'd come at night, they'd come home and start playing the xylophone, and you just sit there and say, wow, this is an amazing virtuoso. And you just try to soak in as much as possible. And I learned so many things there, many of which I didn't even fully appreciate until many, many years after I got back to the States.
And was that the experience? I mean, you must have gone there because you had a great interest in different world cultures and ethnomusicology. But I mean, that seems to me to be the third stream in your development of, because you then spent time in Bulgaria and other places as well, and you seem like in that way just an incredible musical polymath that you've gained such interest in so many different cultures.
Well, each thing was always dictated by something I was interested in. So I just loved, I loved a lot of West African music, and I wanted to get closer to understanding the structure from within, but from the folks there themselves, and to have the context, because sometimes you get music these days from YouTube with no context. It's just like, it's just kind of, you get the surface, but you don't get what's underneath, because we experience a lot of life through a screen. Like there's a screen that's in front, and then we don't have the smells and the sights and the sounds around it, and to get context, to understand how people are dancing when the music is played, because then you understand the structure of the music. If you don't understand the dance, you don't really understand the music, because it's tied so strongly. And that's true in many different places. And so I went to Bulgaria or Brazil or Ireland, any of these places. It was just because I was drawn to the music. And so I just let what I loved lead me, which is something Dutilleux always told me. He used to say, on ne peut pas tout aimer. You can't love everything. And so you have to move toward what you love as a composer, because that lets you, because what you love, you will work on harder. Just like as a conductor, I'm sure the repertoire you love, you're going to work on more passionately.
But your loves musically seem much broader than many of your colleagues, in that you have really passionate engagement with a lot of different traditions, even more than most people, which I think is part of your thing. It's part of what makes you, right? It's kind of your natural inquisitive nature.
It's hard to say, because I think people love different kinds of things, and so maybe someone loves illuminated medieval manuscripts, and so they want to study that. Some people are very focused on, like I remember George Crumb once telling me, I took a lesson with him years ago at the Bodin Festival when I was a student, and George said that he was really interested in World War II aviation and things like that. So and he was very interested in illuminated manuscripts. Actually,
right, he's a very engaged person.
Yeah, their passions come in whatever way they come. But I think the important thing is that you're aware of that as a composer, that you focus on it and you don't run from it. You don't say, "Oh, this seems stupid. I shouldn't love this.
Doesn't fit my profile," or whatever.
Yeah. I was very interested in hip hop. I came up at the time when I was in junior high and high school. Hip hop was just coming up in New York, and so I loved all that early hip hop, Grandmaster Flash, Run DMC, even before Run DMC, Fatback Man, and stuff like that. And this very early hip hop was exciting. It was coming of age. Starting in the Bronx and then Rakim. These incredible rappers who were really, at that point in my growth, I was in high school and even early in college, and there were these rappers who were basically doing what Charlie Parker had done in jazz. They were breaking it open. They were going over the bar line. They were remaking it anew. This was the music that was the most innovative, and this was the freshest, and it was happening right in front of our eyes in New York. It was so exciting. So to not be part of that felt like really not having your
headphones on.
It felt like having blinders on
Right.
to not be part of that. Because everybody in my high school, everybody in the track team, I was on the track, everybody was rapping, everybody knew all the rhymes, So to not know the rhymes was like, if you didn't know them, you were out of such an important kind of phenomenon going on. And that's not to say everybody had to love that, because not everybody loved it, but it was just such an important part of what everybody was doing then. It was so formative.
And just in case anybody doesn't know, you're one of the most accomplished rappers in 5/4 and 7/4, right? You're an irregular rap guru. I've heard you rap in irregular meters, and it's fantastic. It's really good. Yeah. So I think we've gone for quite a while already. I think we hit the half-hour mark, maybe.
Oh,
so
yeah.
You were watching the clock, right? So I think this clearly is the first of maybe 24 episodes of interviews with you. We haven't made it that far, but to me, it's always really fascinating, particularly with you, to hear, of different aspects of your influence, because these things all find their ways in very organic and quite remarkable ways into your music, which I guess would be my final question, was how do you manage all that if you have that many passions? How do you, I guess at your age, at your stage, now that you've done it for a while, now that you're a middle-aged guy like I am, it's probably less a question of like, what do I put in the piece? It's just you now. Is that the way it works, or?
Well, now you have, for me, what's been gratifying is to have champions as you are and the Albany Symphony. You find people that can interpret your fanciful dreams, which is what you put into your music, whether it's orchestral music or chamber music or some crazy project, opera, theatrical. And so I've been lucky to work with so many great musicians over the years, and you being one of them, and the orchestra being a very important part of my development as a composer and on into the future. And so I'm grateful for our disc that we made together. And that's what you do with that. You find people to work with and you find people to help, because as a composer, you can't do it alone.
Right, and as a conductor, you really can't do it alone. And that was a beautiful way to bring it back around to the Albany Symphony, because we've loved our many-decade, I guess now, or multi-decade relationship with you, and have been very proud to not only play your pieces, but to commission them and to record them. And so we're really glad that you allow us to join you in that journey. That's really great. So that's a good stopping point. So you stay well, and I'll talk to you soon. Okay, but thank you for all your wonderful, beautiful music and all your help, because you're one of my, best advisors and mentor, consultant, helper people. So thank you for all that. I really appreciate it.
All right.
All right. Stay safe.
All right. Stay
Bye,
safe. Love to your family.
You too. Okay. Bye.